Hey, what's going on guys? Tanmay here for Simple Snippets and welcome back to another video tutorial on pattern printing programs. And as the title of the video suggests, today we're going to take a look at two simple triangle patterns which we're going to learn how to print, and we're going to understand the code behind these two different patterns. And as you can see on the screen, I have four different triangle patterns along with their for loop code. Now I'm assuming you guys already know some general purpose programming language, preferably C++ because we're going to write program in C++, but any other general purpose programming language will do. The logic is going to be the same. And in this video we're going to take a look at how you can print triangle pattern 1 and triangle pattern 2. These are also known as half pyramids because they look like a half pyramid. And before you think that this for loop is pretty easy, you can just mug it up, you can just by heart it, please don't do that. If you're someone who's an absolute beginner and who has a little bit of idea of pattern printing programs, but you don't really understand what happens at every step, please make sure you watch this video till the end. I can assure you that after watching this entire video, you will never ever try to by heart the for loops, because you'll definitely understand just by looking at the patterns how to go about it. And if not, at least you'll get a practice, because as we progress throughout this entire pattern printing programs series, slowly you'll understand how the for loops work in detail and you'll get better at it. Okay? Alright, enough of the introduction. In the previous tutorial, that is the first video of this course, we understood why pattern printing programs are important and how to go about it, and our approach, which is going to be dry running the entire for loops as well as drawing the output step by step at every iteration. So that's what we're going to do to understand these patterns. So with that being said, let's get started with pattern number 1. If you're new to my channel, my name is Tanmay Sakpal and I do a lot of computer science and information technology video tutorials like computer programming, development, technology talks, and a lot more on this channel. So if that's something you're interested into, then definitely subscribe and turn on the notifications to get the latest updates and never miss out on such important topics. Okay, so first let's understand theoretically as well as the dry running aspect of this pattern, and then we will jump to the dev C++ ID where we will write this program and execute this for loops. So taking a look at this triangle pattern, this is what we want in our output. Okay, so we need to write a program which prints this pattern. So just by observing this triangle pattern, you can see that there are 5 levels, right? So this is 1, this is 2, 3, 4 and 5. Okay, so just by observing this pattern, we can conclude that we need to run a loop which will run for 5 times. Okay, simple enough. So far we've concluded that depending upon the number of levels, that many number of times we need to run a for loop or any other loop. Now we are taking for loop because in most cases we will know how many number of iterations are supposed to be done. Now we can also use while loop, but preferably when you already know the number of iterations, for loop is selected. That's the basic difference between for and while. Otherwise both of them are the same. I'm assuming you guys already know these basic looping control structures concepts in any other general purpose programming language. Okay? Alright. So next thing that we observe is at every iteration what is happening? 1 star is increasing. Now this star character can be anything. Okay, so this is just for representation, but it can be something like 1 1 1 1 1 1 1 1 1, or this symbol can be anything from your keyboard, right? So for here we are just taking star, but observing this at every iteration, the number of the star is increasing. So the second observation that we make is that we require some mechanism which also increments or which also makes or prints this extra star at every iteration, right? Okay, so for that we will require one more for loop, and hence there are 2 for loops in this code. So this is the piece of code that is going to print this pattern. And now let's try to understand or basically dry run this for loop to see how this pattern gets printed, because that's the best way to understand the pattern printing programs, that is to take the for loops and dry run them step by step. So for that, on the right hand side you can see I have 2 separate blocks. The first block says variable values. So the variables included over here are int I in the for loop, and the inner for loop we have int j. So let me write I and j over here. There is one more variable n, and this n is basically nothing but the number of levels that you want. Okay, so that can be taken from the user also, or you can hard code it. Over here we know that n is equal to 5, right? So let's write n equals to 5. So what we're going to do is we're going to track the variable values I and j at every iteration, and at this screen, this is the output screen where we will draw the output. So inside the second for loop, you can see you have cout, and then you have a star, and then there is a little bit of space. We don't need that space, so let me change that. Okay, so this is what we are printing, right? Cout is for printing in C++. If you're using Java, it would be something like system.out.println, or any other general purpose programming language. You will have some print function which prints some text onto the screen, onto the command prompt, right? So that is what we are going to track over here. All right. Okay, so let's start. So at the very first iteration, that is the first for loop. So the first outer for loop is going to run for 5 times. Why? Because let's observe what we have inside. We say int I equals to 1. So initially I is going to be equal to 1. And then we say I less than equal to n. The condition is I less than equal to n. What is n? N is 5. So I will run from 1, 2, 3, 4 and also 5 because it is less than and equal to 5. If it starts from 0, it will be less than 5. Okay, but we have less than equal to. So you can see that outer for loop is going to run for 5 times. So this outer for loop is what is responsible for these levels. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So what is the inner for loop for? Let's understand that. So we've decided I is equal to 1 for the first time. Then the condition is checked. What is the condition? I has to be less than n. Now I is 1. Is 1 less than 5? Yes. Less than equal to? Yes, it is true. So we will go inside the for loop. Now inside the for loop, the j will be initialized. Okay. So now we say j equals to 1. So again, for starters, j is initialized as 1. Now this inner for loop has a different purpose. And the purpose of this inner for loop is to print these stars as well as increment the number of stars printed. So the inner for loop for the first time will run only one time and 1 star will be printed. Inner for loop will run 2 times for the second iteration, that is for the second outer for loop, that is for the second level. For the third level, the inner for loop will run or should run 3 times. For the fourth level or fourth outer iteration, the inner for loop should run 4 times so that 4 stars get printed. And lastly, for the last level, the inner for loop should run 5 times so that 5 stars get printed. So this is the logic, right? So there has to be some relation between I and j, and that is what this condition is all about, the second for loop's condition. Here we are saying j is less than equal to I. So why do we say this? So initially right now you can see we have j equals to 1 and I equals to 1. So when you come inside the for loop, that is when you come at this level, when you say j equals to 1 and now you are checking the condition, is j less than equal to I? You can see from the variable values I and j are equal, that is 1 and 1. So yes, j is not less but it is equal to I, right? 1 is equal to 1. So now we will go inside this for loop and we will say cout star. So the very first star will be printed, right? Okay, so now again we will come at the start of the for loop and we will say j++. So the increment happens for the next round, right? So now the j value becomes 2. Okay. So of course in for loop initialization happens only once. So now only increment will happen and now again the condition will be checked. Is j less than or equal to I? What is I? I is still 1. J has become 2. Is 2 less than or equal to 1? No, because 2 is greater than 1. So now the condition becomes false and we don't go inside this for loop to print out one more star. So we will come outside this for loop, and outside this for loop we have one large statement which is cout endl, and endl is nothing but a command which takes the cursor on the command prompt to the next line. So we will come to the next line. Alright, and that is the end of the outer for loop. So again we will go at the start of the outer for loop. Over here I was 1. Now I will become ++. You can see that is the increment. So I becomes 2. Again the condition is checked. Is I less than equal to n? What is n? N is going to be fixed, which is entered by the user. In this case it is 5. Is 2 less than equal to 5? Yes, it is true, right? 2 is still less than 5. So now again we will go inside the outer for loop. Okay. Now when we go inside the outer for loop, what will happen? First let's change I equals to 2. Inside the for loop, the second for loop will be again executed, right? When it is again executed, we will say int j equals to 1. So j now becomes 1. Then we check the condition, is j less than I? J has become 1 and I has become 2. Is 1 less than or equal to 2? Yes. So we will go inside the inner for loop and we will say cout star. And we are on the next line in the command prompt, so we will print 1 star. Okay. After this command, this is the end of the inner for loop. We will again go to the start of the inner for loop. J becomes plus plus. So now j becomes 2. Right? Let's write 2 over here. Let's write 2 over here. Is 2 less than equal to 2? Yes. So now the condition is true because 2 is not less than 2, but 2 is equal to 2. That is I and j are equal, right? So again you will go inside the for loop for the second time and print 1 more star on the same line because you have not yet come outside the for loop to execute the endl. So you are still on the same line in the command prompt, so you print 1 more star this time. Okay, so once you print that 1 more star, you'll come at the end of the for loop, again go to the start of the for loop and j plus plus, j will become 3. Let's write 3 over here. And now again the condition is checked. Is 3 less than equal to 2? Because I is always going to be 2. You can see I has not yet changed. So is 3 less than or equal to 2? No, 3 is greater than 2. So now the inner for loop will not be executed. You will come outside the inner for loop and go to the last instruction of the outer for loop, which is cout endl. So again you will come at the new line. Okay. After this you will again go to the start of the for loop, that is the outer for loop. I will become plus plus. I will become 3. Let's write 3 over here. Again the condition is going to be checked over here. Is 3 less than equal to n? N is 5. I has become 3. 3 is less than, of course, 5. So now you can see there is a pattern going on here where at every iteration the inner for loop executes 1 more time. For the first time the inner for loop executed 1 time and printed 1 star. For the second iteration the inner for loop ran 2 times and printed 2 stars, just like what we want in the pattern. And this is because of this condition, j less than equal to I. Okay, so this condition is important. How do you determine this condition? So this is where you need to apply your brains, apply your logic of how the condition should happen. Okay, by observing the pattern. So initially when we observed the pattern, we understood that we had 5 levels. So we concluded that the outer for loop is gonna handle the levels, that is the number of times the pattern is supposed to be printed. And further observing, we understood that at every iteration there is 1 star or 1 design extra to be printed. So that's where we determined the inner for loop will run 1 time for the first line, it will run 2 times for the second level, it will run 3 times for the third level. So that is the reason why we gave this condition, because for the first time or the first iteration I is always going to be 1. So if we assign j equals to 1 and then we will say j is less than I, so for the first time j will only iterate once, that is the inner for loop will only iterate once. When I becomes 2, the second time, that is the second time the inner for loop runs from 1 to 2, the pattern will be printed 2 times. When I becomes 3, the third iteration for the for loop starts from 1 to 3. So 1, 2 and 3 are the values that the inner for loop will take, that is the j value will take, and the pattern will be printed 3 times. So similarly this time the pattern will be printed 3 times. When I becomes 3, so j will range from 1 to 3. When I becomes 4, 4 is still less than equal to 5, then j will now go from 1 to 4, right? J will start from 1 always, but it will always be less than equal to I. I is 4, so it will run from 1 to 4 and 4 times the pattern will be printed on the next line. And the reason why we are going on the next line is because of this instruction cout endl, right? So star will be first printed 4 times and then we will go on the next line. This time I will become 5. I'm speeding up a little bit, but I'm assuming you guys got the condition and how we've put this exact condition. So when I becomes 5, j will iterate from 1 to 5, which is 5 times. So 5 times the pattern will be printed. So star, 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 star and star, and again we will come on new line. Then I will become 6, and this is where the outer condition, that is the outer for loop condition, will become false, because now 6 is 6 less than equal to 5, n is 5, right? So is 6 less than 5? No. Is 6 equal to 5? No. So now the outer for loop will stop working and we will come outside the for loop and do other work, whatever is there in the code. So you can see we have successfully printed the star pattern, which looks exactly like this, the triangle pattern or half pyramid. So the most important part over here was to understand the conditions, especially for the inner for loop. Okay, always remember the outer for loop is pretty much used just for the levels. Okay, that is the number of lines you want to print, and what you want to print inside these number of lines is determined from the inner for loop. Now this code can also differ. So for this same pattern, you can also start from I equals to 5 and go till 1, okay, by saying I minus minus, but then the inner condition will change. So if you've seen some other different code which is also working, then just try to dry run that code and see why the condition is given in that sense, because the condition will change, and once you get a hang of it, you can write your own code. Okay, so I hope you've got the triangle pattern 1. Let's jump to the C++ IDE, that is the Dev C++ IDE, and try to run this code and see the output with our own eyes. Okay, so this is my Dev C++ IDE where I write my C++ code. As I've mentioned, you can use any other general purpose programming language. The logic is going to be the same, that is the conditions in the for loop, and pretty much all the general purpose programming languages have looping control statements, especially the for loop is pretty common. We have it in JavaScript, we have it in Java, and I guess other general purpose programming languages also. So you can see that I've already typed in the code because of course we don't want to waste time. It is pretty much the exact same thing that we saw, and this is the half pyramid pattern 1. Everything else is the default boilerplate that you type. So you have hash include iostream, you have using namespace standard. So I'm creating this function which will take int n from the user. I hope you know how to create functions, and then it will run the pattern for n times, and inside that the second for loop, the inner for loop, will print out those star patterns. So this can be anything. Now coming down, we have other functions which we will discuss later, but this is where the more important part is. So over here the int main function is where the starting point is for the C++ execution. We say int num and we ask the user to enter the number of levels of the pattern. Then the user will enter the num value. We will say cin, take the num from the user, and we will call the function that we created half pattern, that is half pyramid pattern 1, and pass the num value. Okay, so let's save this and try to execute, compile and run. Also, I'm obviously going to be sharing all the code with you guys on our official website. So if you want this exact code, check out the video description. You'll find the code and some extra resources as well. So hitting on compile and run. Okay, our program is working fine. Let's enter 6 this time, and when I hit enter, there you go, you can see we've got the proper triangle pattern or half pyramid. So for the first time there is 1 star, then we have 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, and then 6. We typed 6, that's why the 6 levels were printed. If you want, you can check with some other value. Let's enter 15 levels, hit enter, and there you go, it's working perfectly fine. You don't have to hardcode the values. This way you are flexible and you can take the number of levels from the user. Okay, so this is that code. I'm obviously going to be sharing, but I'm assuming you guys have already understood it. If you're a beginner, I highly recommend don't copy paste it for the first time, just type it out. You might still make some silly mistakes, and when you correct it, it will be more understandable. Okay, let's jump to the digital blackboard and now move on to the second pattern. Okay, so first pattern is done. The second pattern looks like a triangle, but it is flipped horizontally. So it starts with the higher number of stars and moves to the lower number of stars. Okay, so let's try to observe this, and then we will dry run this code for this triangle pattern with the variable values and the output. So just by looking at it now, again by observing, you can see that we have 5 levels, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So by observing this, we know and we can conclude that we require one for loop, the first for loop, which will run for 5 times or basically n times depending upon how many number of levels you want. Okay, so the first for loop has to run n times depending upon the level. The next observation you can do is, you can see that at every level 1 star is reduced. So for 5 levels, the first level has 5 stars. For second level, we have 1 less, which is 4 star. Then we have 3 stars, 2 star and 1 star. And then of course the pattern stops because we will not have anything to print. Alright, so how to go about this pattern now? So over here in the first for loop, what we're doing is, we're saying int I equals to n. So let's start to track the variable values. I'll write I, I'll write j, and we know that n is 5. We are assuming n as 5 this time. So for the first time, we're using the for loop in a reverse way. So the outer for loop, we are saying I equals to n. So for the first time, I will become 5 because n is also 5. And now we are saying I is greater than equal to 1 and I minus minus. So this will do nothing but it will go from 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. Right? It will run in a reverse way, but of course it will only run for 5 times, from 5 to 1. So no matter what you start, you can start from 1 to 5 or 5 to 1. But of course the outer for loop's purpose is just for this levels, right? So in the end, we want the outer for loop to run 5 times, and it doesn't matter if it starts from 1 to 5 or 5 to 1. But in this case, it matters that we go in a reverse order, because depending upon what you have in the outer for loop's condition, the inner for loop's condition changes. So the outer for loop is going to run for 5 times using this code. That is something that is basic. You've understood this. Now let's move on to the inner for loop. So inner for loop, we say int j equals to I. So initially I is 5. So j will also become 5, right? And now I hope you are understanding why I started from I equals to n. So for the first time I will become 5 and j will also become 5. And remember, for the first time we want to print 5 stars. So that's why we are starting in a reverse order for the outer for loop, so that inner for loop gets matched with it. Because inner for loop has a relation with outer for loop. And that is what we are trying to understand. So now int j equals to I means that j also becomes 5. Then we say j has to be greater than 0. And then we say j minus minus. So of course the inner for loop for the very first time will start from j equals to 5, which is 5. Then it will become 4, and we will check the condition, is j greater than 0? Yes. Then we will say j minus minus, j will become 3. It is still greater than 0, j will become 2. It is still greater than 0, j will become 1. It is still greater than 0. And then it will become 0 and the condition will become false. So it will run 5 times. And every time it will print out this star pattern. So we don't need this space. Let me remove it out. So I hope you're getting why the very first iteration of the outer for loop, the inner for loop, is running 5 times. If not, let's actually try to, go step by step. Alright. So now we say j equals to 5. Is 5 greater than 0? Yes. So we'll go inside the for loop. We will say print cout star. So on the output screen, we will print the first star. Then we will come at the end of the inner for loop. Again, go at the start of the inner for loop. We will say j minus minus. So j becomes 4. Right? So we'll again check, is 4 greater than 0? Yes. So again, one more star is printed at the same line, because we've not reached end L. So again we'll come at the end of the for loop, that is inner for loop. Again go to the start and j minus minus. J will become 3. Is 3 greater than 0? Yes. Again go inside the inner for loop, print one more star. Come at the end of the inner for loop. Again go to the start of the inner for loop. J minus minus, that is decrement happens. It becomes 2. Let's write 2 over here also. Is 2 greater than 0? Of course it is. Go again inside the for loop. Again print one more star. Come at the end of the inner for loop. Go to the start. Again j minus minus. J becomes 1. Let's write 1 over here and 1 over here. Is 1 greater than 0? Yes it is. Again go inside the inner for loop. Print this star again. Again go to the start of the for loop. That is inner for loop. It becomes 0. And now the condition becomes false, because 0 is of course not greater than 0. It is equal to 0, but the condition has to be greater than 0. So now you will exit the for loop, that is the inner for loop, and come at the last statement of the outer for loop, which is cout end L, which will take the cursor to the new line. Then you will again come at the start of the for loop, that is the outer for loop. I was initially n, which is 5, but now we say I minus minus, so I now becomes 4. Okay. Now the condition is checked. Is I greater than equal to 1? Is 4 greater than equal to 1? Yes it is. 4 is greater than 1. So you'll go inside the first, that is outer for loop. And now over here we will say j equals to I. What is the new value of I? I has become 4. So initialization of j will also start from 4. So j will also become 4. J equal to 4 over here. Is 4 greater than 0? This is the condition. Yes. So you'll go inside and now you'll print one more star. Again come at the start of the inner for loop, j minus minus. So you can see now there is a pattern going on. This time J will run from 4, 3, 2 and 1, which is 4 times. So 4 stars are gonna be printed. Then you'll exit this inner for loop, see out endl, you'll come on a new line, go to the start, I minus minus will happen, I will become 3. Then you'll go inside the outer for loop because of course 3 is greater than 1. When you go inside the inner for loop, you will say j equals to I. So j will now become 3 because I has also become 3. Is 3 greater than 0? Yes. So now the inner for loop will run from 3 to 1, that is 3 times. So 3 times star is going to be printed. Then you'll exit out, you'll print endl, I will become 2, j will also become 2. Then you'll print it 2 times, right? Because now the inner for loop will run from 2 and 1, so 2 times. Then you'll come at the new line, the inner for loop will run only 1 time because I has become 1 and j will also become 1. And while checking the outer for loop condition, the condition is I greater than or equal to 1. Is 1 greater than or equal to 1? Yes. It is not greater than 1, but it is equal to 1. So this is the one last time that the outer for loop is also gonna run. And inside that, when j is also 1, j is greater than 0, right? So it will go from 1 to 0. And when the condition becomes false, you will come outside and ultimately you will have this reverse half pyramid pattern printed. Okay? So I hope you got the dry running steps. We went a little fast because I'm assuming now you've got a hang of it. And the key over here is always going to be the condition which goes inside the second for loop, which is the inner for loop. Okay? Always remember the outer for loop is just related or is just used for the levels. But the inner for loop, the condition has to be in such a way that you get the desired output. Now in our pattern 2 case, what we did, we ran the outer for loop from 5 to 1. And the reason why we ran it in a reverse order is because the pattern had the most stars in the first level. Then we had 1 less. So when we start from 5 to 1, the first level is having 5 stars. So we can use this logic, that is use this number and relate it with the inner for loop. So inner for loop we say j equals to I. So j also becomes 5. And then you can run the inner for loop 5 times for the very first level. That is for the very first iteration of the outer for loop. Then when I becomes 1 less by decrementing, I becomes 4. Then j also becomes 4, right? J will start from 4 and it will go till 0 by saying j minus minus. So that's the condition. So also the condition matters. So for the second level, the inner for loop will run 4 times. So 4 stars will be printed and so on and so forth. So for third level, the inner for loop will run only 3 times and that goes on and on. So the real crux over here is this conditions that you have to give. And honestly speaking, initially as a beginner, a lot of times these conditions are trial and error. You might not get it at the very first time. So don't get disheartened. Just try to observe the triangle, the pattern that you've given basically, and try to make a logic yourself. The first logic is very easy, right? The for loop logic is very easy. That is the outer for loop that I'm talking. Now this outer for loop you could have also ran from 1 to 5, right? Because ultimately it is only related to the levels. But then the condition inside of the inner for loop would have changed. That's why we ran the outer for loop in a reverse order. So that the inner for loop we can say j equals to I and print that many number of times. So you can keep on experimenting with these conditions. You can do a reverse loop. You can change the conditions and try to get this pattern. But please don't try to by heart this. I'm assuming you guys have understood this dry run part and the diagram. Let's try to see the program so that it gets even more easy. Okay, coming to the coding part. In the Dev C++ IDE, this is where I've created one more function which says half pyramid pattern 2. It takes a number int as an argument n, and then we will use the same for loop that we just saw when we were dry running it. So this is a user defined function that we've created. Coming down in the main function, let's comment the first pattern and we are dealing with the second pattern now. So this is the pattern 2. Let's try to compile and run this. Let's enter 5, hit enter, and there you go. Our pattern is printed successfully. So you can have any other number also, and that many number of levels will be printed and the pattern will be printed accordingly. So just to show you, if I enter 20, there you go, you can see a huge reverse triangle or inverted triangle, and it is following the exact same logic. Okay, so this was all about the two different patterns that we saw in this tutorial. We have 3 and 4 also. So coming back to the digital blackboard, we just saw pattern 1 and 2. We also have pattern 3 and 4, which is having a little more extra step, and we'll see that in the second tutorial, that is the next part of this video. And we'll follow the same process of dry running it, seeing the output with the diagram, and then the code. Okay, so I'm gonna conclude this video over here. If you want the code, I've shared the exact code in the video description. Please don't copy paste it initially. Try to, develop your own logic by using trial and error. See the pattern. Try to, formulate the for loop by taking step-by-step approach, the dry run approach, and drawing out the pattern. And that's the best way to learn pattern printing programs. And initially, as I mentioned, you're gonna suck at it. You're gonna make a few more mistakes till you get the pattern right. Okay, so that's it for this video, guys. I hope you understood this simple triangle or half pyramid pattern, that is pattern 1 and 2. Next video we will go on pattern 3 and 4. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments how this video was. Do share it with your friends. Pattern printing programs are very important. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.